80% of the nerve fibers connecting your gut to your brain carry their signal in one direction, and it is the direction almost nobody expects, upward from the gut to the brain and rarely the reverse. The gut mostly talks and the brain, it turns out, mostly listens. There is a lining inside you, wrapped around the whole length of your intestine, that runs its own nervous system. Roughly 400 million neurons of its own, more than you carry in your entire spinal cord. And a single great nerve, the vagus, threads up out of all that machinery and carries its status report to the brain. Some 80,000 fibers between the gut and the head, and 4 out of every 5 of them are pointed the wrong way for what you would have guessed. They are reporting up. So the feeling you get in your stomach when a hard day begins runs the opposite way from what you would assume. It is the gut reaching up to tell the brain something. And when stress arrives, two things happen together in one instant. The signal changes, and the wall the signal is reporting on changes with it. Hold on to that because it is the whole thing. The wall and the report about the wall. Both move together, and once you see how, you will understand something about a stressful week that almost nobody explains correctly. That wall is the place to start. Because for something carrying the entire weight of what follows, it is almost impossibly thin. The barrier between the inside of your body and the largest population of living organisms you will ever host is 1 cell thick. A single layer of lining cells, standing shoulder to shoulder, sealed along their edges. On one side, your sterile bloodstream. On the other, something close to 38 trillion bacteria, the full resident population of the gut, pressed right up against that 1 cell sheet, one layer. That is all that stands between the two worlds. You might reasonably ask why the body would build something so critical so thin. Why not a thick, safe, redundant wall? And the answer is a trade-off the body could not avoid. That same lining is where you absorb everything you eat, every nutrient passing from the gut into the blood, and absorption demands closeness. A thick wall would be safe and useless because nothing could cross it fast enough to feed you. So the barrier had to be pressed down to a single cell, thin enough to let nutrition pour through, and the entire burden of keeping bacteria out was handed to the seams between those cells rather than to any thickness of wall. The gut chose absorption over armor, and paid for that choice by making the seam the only thing standing between you and 38 trillion bacteria. Which is precisely why what stress does to that seal matters as much as it does. What holds that layer sealed is worth picturing plainly. Imagine floor tiles laid edge to edge, and along every seam a bead of living grout that is constantly being reapplied. The cells are the tiles. The grout is a set of proteins strung between them, stitching neighbor to neighbor so tightly that not even a bacterium can slip through the seam. These sealing proteins have names the moment you have earned them by picturing the grout: claudin, occludin. They are the actual stitching along the edge of every lining cell, and they are living, temporary things. They are maintained moment to moment. Something has to keep laying fresh sealant, or the seams begin to open. Consider why the seam matters so much. It is doing a genuinely hard job every second. It works as a filter more than a barricade, its whole job being to let the right things through while holding the wrong things back. Water crosses it, and the nutrients from your food cross it, while the bacteria never do. That selectivity lives entirely in the grout, in how tightly the proteins hold the gap between one tile and the next. Loosen that seal even a little, and the filter stops discriminating. The gap that was letting a water molecule through begins to let far larger things through. Selectivity lives in the seam rather than the tile. The gap between the cells is where the discrimination happens. It is worth pausing, too, on those 400 million neurons in the gut wall, because they are not merely a relay passing messages to the head. That local nervous system runs the digestion on its own, timing the muscular waves, adjusting the secretions, coordinating the whole slow process without asking the brain's permission for any of it. The people who study it gave it an old nickname, the second brain, and the nickname is earned. Cut the vagus entirely. The gut still digests, still contracts in sequence, still manages itself, a self-governing system that happens to file a report upstairs. Which means when that report changes, the brain is hearing from an organ that governs itself, one that knows its own state intimately and describes it accurately. Bring the stress in now, and watch what it does to the seal. Well, when a difficult morning hits, the first thing that moves is blood. and it moves astonishingly fast. Within a fraction of a second of your body deciding something is a threat, the emergency branch of your nervous system has already begun redirecting where blood goes. In roughly 200 milliseconds, faster than you can consciously register the fright, the vessels feeding the gut are already clamping. The body treats a stressor the way it treats a physical emergency. Digestion in an emergency is a luxury. There is no point finishing lunch if you're about to be eaten, so the intestine is demoted, its blood shunted toward muscle and heart and brain. The name for that redirection is splanchnic vasoconstriction, and the name matters far less than the consequence. The lining that was holding the whole barrier together just had its blood supply cut back, and it happened before you finished flinching. 200 milliseconds to demote the gut. 20 minutes for the wall to start paying for it. Blood is not the only thing that stalls. The gut has a slow, deliberate housekeeping rhythm you have almost certainly never noticed, a wave of muscular contraction that sweeps the small intestine clean between meals, roughly every 90 minutes, pushing residue and stray bacteria downstream and out. It is a cleaning cycle, and it only runs when the gut is calm and unfed. Stress hormones switch it off. The sweep stops. And when the sweep stops, the small intestine loses the one mechanism that kept its bacterial population from creeping upward and settling where it should not. Traffic that should be flushing steadily through begins to sit, and bacteria, given still water and time, do what bacteria always do. They multiply where they are not wanted. So what does still water do to a population that was held in balance only by constant motion? A whole resident population reorganizes once the environment stops moving and the chemistry shifts under stress, the calmer long-term residents giving ground to the opportunists, as Bailey and colleagues traced in animal models. The human evidence points in that direction too, though from less controlled ground than a laboratory allows. And this reorganization runs deeper than who lives where. It changes what the gut manufactures, because some of those resident bacteria have a job you were never told about. They ferment the fiber you eat and produce a short molecule that is the single most important fuel for the cells lining your colon. That molecule is butyrate, and the lining cells burn it for the majority of their energy, something on the order of 70%. Read that again slowly. The cells whose entire purpose is to hold the barrier sealed are largely powered by a fuel that certain gut bacteria hand them. It is a strange arrangement when you sit with it. The wall that keeps the bacteria out is fed by the bacteria it is keeping out. Starve the bacteria that make the fuel, or drive them out and replace them with residents that do not, and you starve the very cells maintaining the wall. The grout stops being laid for a quiet reason. The workers laying it have run out of energy, though nothing attacked it. How many separate pressures are landing on that one cell sheet all at once? By now the blood supply has been cut, and the cortisol is directly loosening the sealing proteins. And the fuel that powers the sealing cells is drying up because the bacteria that make it have been pushed aside. Cortisol degrading the grout is the piece that has been shown most cleanly. Garreau and colleagues, again in animal models, demonstrated that stress conditions pull down those tight sealing proteins directly, the seal thinning from the top while the fuel fails from below. 3 assaults arriving together on a seam that was only ever a bead of living protein. It is worth understanding how cortisol reaches that stitching at all, because it does not touch it from the outside. Cortisol slips straight through the outer skin of the lining cell, being the kind of molecule that passes through membranes freely. Inside, a receptor is waiting. Once cortisol locks into it, that receptor travels to the cell's control center and changes which instructions the cell is running, and among the instructions it turns down is the one that keeps the cell manufacturing sealing proteins. The order for fresh grout is quietly reduced, so the seal thins for a subtler reason than dissolving. Cortisol reached in and cut the supply from the inside. The seam loosens by an instruction from the inside, at the level of what the cell has been told to build. There's a mercy built into this, and also a trap. In a short, sharp stress, the instruction is turned down briefly and then turned back up, and the wall reseals within hours, no harm done. The system was designed for exactly that. For a threat that comes and goes. The trap is what happens when the stress does not come and go, when the instruction stays turned down for days and weeks, and the wall never gets the uninterrupted stretch of calm it needs to fully reseal. Acute stress borrows against the barrier and repays it. Chronic stress borrows and never repays. and the det is a seam that stays a little open. The seam opens. Not dramatically. Not a wound. Just microscopically wider than it was along thousands of tile edges all at once. And the barrier that is microscopically wider is no longer the discriminating filter it was a moment ago. The gap that admitted water now admits things the size of molecules that were always meant to stay on the bacterial side. Something can cross now that could not cross this morning. And this is the point where an upset stomach quietly becomes something with reach. What crosses is a fragment from the outer coat of certain gut bacteria. When those bacteria die, and they die constantly, they shed pieces of their outer wall. One component of that wall is a molecule your immune system was built to treat as an unmistakable signature of invasion. It is called lipopolysaccharide, which is simply the sugar and fat molecule that forms the outer skin of those bacteria, and your bloodstream is supposed to never meet it. Inside the gut, harmless, expected, ignored. Across the wall and into the blood, it is read as one thing only. Bacteria are where they must never be. A permeable barrier lets exactly this fragment translocate from gut into blood, and the immune system reads that signature as proof enough, ahead of any check for whether a live infection actually exists. The signature alone triggers the alarm. Why that fragment triggers such certainty is worth seeing, because the immune system is built to find it. Your immune cells carry a dedicated sensor built for one purpose, to recognize the outer skin of exactly these bacteria. Over the long history of the body's defenses, that molecule turned out to be one of the most reliable fingerprints of bacterial presence there is. So evolution built a lock shaped precisely for that key. When the fragment fits the lock, the cell commits on the spot. It assumes, on the strength of that one molecular signature, that a bacterial invasion is underway, and it launches the full inflammatory response accordingly. The specificity is the whole problem. The sensor is so trustworthy that a fragment leaking through a stressed wall, with no live infection behind it at all, sets off the identical alarm a real invasion would. An alarm goes off in the blood, all of it, while nothing has actually infected you. Your immune cells meet that fragment and answer the way they would answer a real breach. They release inflammatory messengers into the bloodstream, small signaling proteins that travel everywhere the blood goes and announce that something is wrong. Low-grade, systemic, quiet, not an illness you would name. Just a body running with its alarm signal switched faintly on, sourced from a wall that is letting a little too much through. Chances are you have felt the result of this without ever having a word for it. The flat, foggy heaviness during a stressful stretch, the fatigue that food and sleep and coffee do not seem to fix, the sense of being faintly unwell with nothing you could point a doctor toward. That heaviness is real, and it has a physical source. It is an inflammatory signal generated at a leaking wall, circulating through the whole of you and reaching the brain. Everything up to here has answered the ordinary question. What does stress do to the gut? Blood diverts in a fifth of a second. The cleaning wave stops. Bacteria overgrow and reorganize. The fuel fails. The wall loosens. A fragment crosses. The body lights up faintly with inflammation. If the story ended there, it would already be worth knowing, and it is roughly where most explanations stop. But there is a second question hiding underneath the first, and it is the one that actually matters. Why does the bad stretch not simply end when the stressful thing ends? You have lived this yourself. The deadline finally passes. The argument resolves. The hard week is behind you at last. And yet the stomach is still off. The fog has not lifted. The wound too tight feeling lingers for days, after the reason for it is gone. The stressor left. The state did not. And a state that outlasts its own cause is telling you, plainly, that something else has taken over the job of keeping it running. What could keep the stress response running after the stressor itself is gone? Go back to that inflammatory signal circulating in the blood, the one sourced from the leaking wall, and follow it upward because it does not stay in the body. The brain guards itself behind a barrier of its own, but that barrier has a handful of deliberate gaps, small regions built precisely so the brain can sample what is dissolved in the blood and know the state of the body it lives in. Through those windows, the circulating inflammatory signal reaches the brain directly, and the brain, tasting inflammation in the blood, interprets it the only way it is built to. Inflammation means a threat to the body. A threat means release the stress hormone. So the brain calls for more cortisol. Sit with where that leads, one step at a time, because the shape of it is the entire point. Watch the ring close. More cortisol loosens the sealing proteins further. A looser wall lets more of the bacterial fragment across. More fragment in the blood means more inflammation. More inflammation reaching the brain means the brain reads a larger threat and calls for more cortisol still. The wall that stress first opened is now feeding the brain the exact signal that makes the brain keep the stress response switched on. Nothing outside you is required anymore. The gut has become the thing the brain is stressed about. That is the loop, and it no longer needs the original problem to keep turning. Your deadline can pass, your argument can end, your week can be over and forgotten. But cortisol is still being called for, summoned now by an inflamed signal rising out of a wall that is not resealed, no longer by anything in your circumstances. The brain has no way to tell the difference. To the brain, a threat is a threat, whether the news arrived from your calendar or from your own intestinal lining, and it answers both identically, because the pathway carrying the news is the very same pathway. And then there is a second door the loop uses at night, which is worth seeing because it explains why the tiredness compounds. Those same inflammatory messengers that reach the brain also disturb the architecture of sleep. They fragment it, shorten the deep restorative stretches, leave you surfacing through the night. And poor sleep is itself a driver of cortisol, lifting the stress hormone the following day. So the leaking wall does not only feed cortisol directly through the blood, it also robs you of the sleep that would have lowered cortisol, and the loss of that sleep raises cortisol again by a second route, which loosens the wall again. The loop runs in the daylight through inflammation and runs again in the dark through broken sleep, two arms of the same ring, tightening on each other. This gut loop is not even the only one running on that stress hormone. There is a separate cycle, working through fat rather than through the gut wall, in which cortisol drives the body to store fat around the organs. And that stored fat in turn produces still more active cortisol locally, calling for more storage. It is a completely different organ, a completely different mechanism, and it feeds the same stress axis from its own direction. So a long stressful period drives at least two loops at once. Same hormone, two organs that never speak to each other, each one independently keeping cortisol elevated after the reason for it is gone. That they compound is the sobering part. The gut is opening while the fat is accumulating. Both are reporting one false emergency upward, and the brain answers all of it with the one response it has. Now be careful exactly here, because this is where honesty earns its place. Every single link in that chain is established on its own. Blood diverting from the gut under stress, the cleaning wave, stopping, cortisol pulling down the sealing proteins, the bacterial shift, the fuel loss, the fragment crossing a leaky wall, the inflammation reaching the brain answering inflammation with more stress hormone, the broken sleep lifting it again. Each of those stands on solid ground. Much of the tight junction and microbiome work is done in animal models, with the human data pointing the same direction from less controlled observation. What is proposed, rather than nailed down, is bolder, that the whole ring closes and turns on its own in a living human after the original stressor has completely gone, that the loop becomes fully self-sustaining, needing nothing further from the outside world, is the strong form of the idea. The links are real. The closed, self-feeding ring is the hypothesis those real links assemble into. Hold it as a mechanism worth taking seriously, not as a settled fact, and you are holding it exactly right. But even the careful version of it changes how you understand the nerve. Because remember what the vagus is. 4 out of 5 of its fibers running upward, gut to brain, carrying the status of that whole lining to the head. Here is the sharpest way to hold what that means. The vagus nerve is mostly a microphone and only a little a speaker. The great upward majority of it is picking up sound from the gut and delivering that sound to the brain. The smaller downward part is the brain speaking back. It is far more a listening device pointed at the gut than a set of commands sent to it. The organ you thought was being ordered around is mostly the organ being heard. So what is the microphone picking up now that the wall has changed? Before the stress, it was picking up the ordinary hum of a sealed, well-fueled, quietly working gut, and the brain, hearing that hum, felt nothing worth noticing. After the wall loosens and the fragment crosses and the inflammation rises, the microphone is picking up a different sound entirely. A wall under strain, a lining struggling, a whole bacterial population fallen into disorder. And it delivers that sound faithfully upward, because a working microphone does not soften what it hears. The report climbing the nerve is no longer the report of a calm gut. It is the report of a gut in trouble, and the brain, receiving it, feels precisely what you feel. Unease with no visible source. The report is honest. The gut really is in trouble. The nerve is only telling the truth. That is the part almost nobody teaches, and it is worth slowing down for. The feeling in your stomach during a long, stressful stretch is a real signal, carried on a real nerve, reporting a real change in a real wall, and the dismissive in your head people usually reach for misreads it entirely. The microphone works. It always worked. It is simply picking up something that genuinely warrants alarm and passing it along without editing. Under sustained stress, the reorganization of that community tracks with the psychological state itself, the wall and the mind moving together, as Kelly and co-workers found across people studied over time. The traffic running on that nerve shapes what the brain does with it, and the wider conversation between gut and brain turns out to be a genuine two-way dialogue mapped in the work of Bershik, Meyer, and their respective groups. Different investigators, different instruments, arriving at one strange picture together. The gut is talking, the brain is listening, and under stress, what the gut has to say gets worse, and the listening brain, by answering it with more cortisol, makes it worse still, which finally raises the only question that offers a way out. If the loop runs because signal keeps rising off an unsealed wall, then anywhere you can help the wall reseal or quiet the signal is a place the ring can be broken. This is a map of where the loop is weak, rather than a set of instructions to act on tonight. It is simply where the physics says the seams in the ring actually sit, and there is a quiet relief in knowing a self-feeding ring still has seams of its own. Now, one weak point is the nerve. That upward-pointing microphone has a downward-pointing minority, the speaker fibers. A slow, extended breath out is one of the few direct levers a person has on them. It nudges the gut back toward the calm rhythm that lets the cleaning wave resume and keeps the fuel-making bacteria fed. Another weak point is the fuel, because the butyrate that powers the sealing cells is manufactured by bacteria fermenting fiber, and that supply is not fixed in stone. Another is cortisol itself. Movement clears it. A long, unhurried walk activates an energy sensor inside muscle that helps draw the circulating stress hormone down, and lower cortisol eases its grip on the seams, letting them begin to reseal from above even as the fuel returns from below. None of these is a switch that stops the loop at once. Each is a place where a ring that draws its whole strength from every link pulling together can be made to pull a little less hard. Here is the quiet reversal sitting at the center of all of this. You came in believing your stress reached down and upset your stomach, top to bottom, brain to gut, the way everyone is taught to picture it. The truth runs mostly the other way. The stomach reaches up and reports to the brain, and under stress it reports trouble, and the brain answers the trouble by manufacturing more of the very hormone that deepens it. The direction you assumed was the small part all along. The direction you never suspected was carrying 80% of the traffic the entire time. Follow it all the way down one last time. The nerve was always more microphone than speaker. 80,000 vagal fibers carrying the gut status report to the brain every second. The barrier was a single cell, thick, locked together by proteins that cortisol weakened, that starvation of butyrate undermined, that bacterial endotoxin degraded from the other side. The stress arrived and the blood diverted and the motility stalled and the bacteria shifted and the fuel supply dropped and the junctions loosened and the endotoxin crossed and the inflammation reached the brain and the brain read the inflammation as a new threat and released more cortisol and the loop locked. The stress could end. The loop, fed by the inflammation the damaged wall produces, continued to drive cortisol through a pathway the brain could not distinguish from ongoing psychological threat. The gut became the stressor the brain could not distinguish from the one that started it. The feeling in the stomach was the status report. The report was accurate, the wall was open, and the loop was running.